so that if he ever ran into trouble, I would take these other artist pages and use them to put the book out on time.
Chat GPT, I wanted more like Raymond Chandler.
Now I want more dialogue and I want more words.
He would draw different pages out of order, so I couldn't track them.
Just to let you know, Dan, we have very sophisticated listeners. Mo! That is not M. Scott. This way I'll be polished. You guys, what did I get myself into? What?
Spicy.
Obviously, you're not on Good Morning America here, okay? Dan, this is the mental space we're in, right? Right? Whoa, it's Dan Didio. Right, and you can't be on Sheehan is Dead without a few mentions of Rob Liefeld. Unbearable working conditions. I need my royalties. Why are you making all these characters from Marvel, but you're making us look bad? Now they want characters from us. Welcome all you Sheehanites to a very special episode of Sheehan is Dead Comics. You go to organicpricebooks.com. You put on in the coupon code at checkout, Sheehan is Dead. You save yourself about $2. When you go over $50, you get free shipping.
Yes, he buys his books by the ton.
That's right. And they back up the truck right here. Beep, beep, beep.
I think I saw Sheehan on the street the other day. He's hanging out with Ken Lay and Michael Jackson on whatever island. It's like a tiny little island that's just off Madagascar. Sheehan is and isn't dead. So
that's 425 cable number ones you can get.
Everyone's chasing the 9/8. It's going to be interesting to me as more and more people get into the graded thing and the census gets filled out more. Now it's like, oh, well, there's 700 of those, especially with the later stuff, right? Because there's never going to be probably 700 9+ Fantastic Four number 5s, but with the later stuff, as everyone's throwing their stuff in, like how much downward pressure there's going to be on the values. You have no piles of shame. She comes out with her cane. She's kind of like Yoda walking across the stones. And I'm like, oh no, this isn't good. So many used bookstores that you go into, it's like what my mother would call the uglies. All the good stuff has been sold. And yeah, you can go into a bookstore that's got 15,000 books, but it's 15,000 books that no one wants.
What's it smell like in there?
Yeah, and that's the other thing, right? Is many are horrible, and musty and whatnot. It's fine. It's not like it's mildew or something. She's been there 51 years. Once it opens, it's just like cars are showing up.
And it was like bizarre and it was ridiculous.
And then, of course, my wife is telling me, like, I read about how much poop whatever is on those screens. And I'm like,
I bet.
Boy.
Whoa, it's Dan Didio.
It was just up your way. I was up in the Catskills a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Cool. Yeah.
On vacation?
Yeah.
Vacation. We finally got a week off. Was up there, up by Roxbury, up by Woodstock, that area.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, let me tell you first. I must tell you, as a huge DC fanboy all my life, this is like having the El Presidente on without the Secret Service. So I'm
Presidente in exile.
Yeah, but still, you were Presidente at the best times of my fandom, and I am just so geeked out. So how have you been, sir?
Oh, good. Keep it busy, that's for sure. We were in California there we made that move from DC, from New York to California back in 2015. And then once my time ran out at DC, wanted to get back on the East Coast. And actually, I'm down in the Florida area now because my wife's from San Juan. All my family's in New York and New Jersey. So we found a mid spot so that we can visit both guys easily. But it's been good. It's been good to change of pace. And,
we're in Florida.
Tampa.
Oh, Tampa. So you're out on the West Coast.
West Coast of it, yeah. So it's been a nice change. Got some friends around here, family. Makes it easier, and still involved in doing some comic stuff, but just on a much more simplistic, slow pace, which I'm happy to say.
Sure.
I don't think I could ever do that pace ever again.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of pace, I must let you know, I am like I said, growing up, huge DC fan. You were the steward of pretty much my fandom. And the New 52, I just got to tell you, I was so excited for that myself personally.
So was I.
Yeah, I bet you were. And like to this day, the New 52 Justice League run with Jeff Johns, Jim Lee, Ivan Reyes, and then my favorite artist of all space and time now, Jason Fabik. That is unassailable. Like that's
Yeah,
the best
they
AL run
that was
ever.
one of the things. I mean, it was the flagship book. At that time you had two executives of the company running it, so we had to make sure it worked. The funny behind the scenes story I always like to tell now, was that there was a question about Jim's delivery, whether or not he'd be able to keep a monthly schedule.
Yeah.
And I said, you got to lead by. I kept on saying to these guys, you got to lead by example. You can't let your book slip, because if you let your book slip, everybody else thinks they can let it slip too. So you got to be on
Right.
time. So it was that. But little did Jim know that during his tenure, early on in the run of his run, I actually had another artist shadowing him, so that I had a separate artist working from the back, going to the front, while Jim was going from front to the back, so that if he ever ran into trouble, I would take these other artist pages and use them to put the book out on time. That's how serious I was about schedule. And and Jim found out.
Oh, he found out. Oh man. Please.
And when Jim found out, what he started doing is he started to draw the pages out of sequence.
Throw you a curveball, a knuckleball. Yeah.
So he would draw different pages out of order, so I couldn't track him on where he was, and I couldn't. So he basically blew up my plan. But the good news is, I think every book ran on time for the 12 issues, except for I think the last one might have been 1 week late, but that's okay. They did a great job with it for sure.
Cool.
Yeah, certainly.
Cool.
And like that was the same thing with Jim and when he did Hush. It was like a
Well,
huge
Hush was a lot different. Hush, we actually had, believe it or not, Hush started before I got there, or just when I got there. One of the two. I'm not sure exactly why. It was put together by Mark Chiarello, and basically they were going to do Hush in the same format as Long Halloween. So they were going to do, they're going to do it as a miniseries, 12-part miniseries, high end, paper stock, cardstock cover, all the bells and whistles that made it feel a little more like a prestige style book. Because that's, Loeb had done that with Tim Sale, wanted to take it over with Jim. So they built the Hush storyline. And I remember sitting down with Jim when I first met him. This is early on, we really didn't know each other well. And we were sitting there talking, and Jim goes, he wants to be the Batman artist. And I remember the publisher at the time said, well, you can't be the Batman artist. You have to be on time and deliver, and you're not going to get a #1.
Was that Paul, the publisher?
That was Paul. Yeah.
Right, okay.
And Paul, so Paul said that to Jim, and Jim said, you give me the regular Batman title and I'll sell it like it's a #1. Exactly.
Yes.
Never forgot that. And but we had it, and then based on that, though, we were able to get the paper upgraded, because that time everything was on newsprint on those days, and only prestige books got on better paper stock. And Jim wanted the glossy paper, like he was getting, like the headed image and all these things. So we actually wound up upgrading the paper, getting it all, and he launched at 608, and it did sell like a #1, which was the best thing. But what that did, it gave us the impetus to start improving the paper stock on a lot of other books.
Yeah.
Upgrading that. And the other fallout was, being on the main title seemed cool now for a lot of these artists. If Lee's on the main title, instead of getting all these prestige books on the side, all of a sudden now all the big guys are starting to look at being on the main titles. And that was a big plus for us, because again, my opinion was always, I was never a big fan of things like Elseworlds and things like that. Not because I didn't like the stories, is I didn't like it drawing all the key talent away from the main line, and everybody doing all the big crazy ideas on the edges. I felt like you always got to try to make the main line drive everything, be the most important part of your storytelling, and then you can spin out things on the sides. But don't make the sides more interesting than what the main line is, because then the main line becomes superfluous to everything else, and your bread and butter is your main books that you put out every week.
You got to pay the bills.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Was it Chiarello who wrote Jim the check that he never cashed?
What's that?
Chiarello, is that
Yeah.
is that the dude who wrote Jim that what was it, $100 check that he never cashed?
Maybe there was something there. Yeah, but Mark was the other on that. I mean, Mark was trained. He was the art director for me when I was there, during my entire tenure. He did a lot of things that people love. He did. He took over the Batman Black and Whites from Archie Goodwin after he passed, and made sure that kept going. He started the solo line of books because he was really an artist. So we'd like to give that format for the artists. Did Wednesday Comics, New Frontier with Darwin Cook. A couple other things along the lines, but there's a lot of things that had always had that high sense of pedigree. Anything that he worked on, he's always brought some real sense of prestige to the material he did, which was always great.
Cool.
Is he? Forgive me. Is he still there, or was he?
No, he left a year before I did.
Okay.
It was a slow attrition and then a very fast dumping of people out of DC for a while.
Yeah. So before I touch that, just to let you know, we're recording anything that.
No, I saw that. Yeah.
Anything you don't want us to put out, we'll gladly edit. So
yeah.
Here's the thing: anything that I say is fine. Anything I don't say is what I probably don't want to say.
Okay.
Okay, fair enough.
Because we've had other creators on, and they're like, "All right, I'm going to tell you this story, but don't put it on." We're like, "All right."
Oh yeah, well I'll wait till you show up the thing. Yeah, but anything else, I'm
okay.
Yeah, I don't have to worry. Good part is I don't have to worry about that stuff as much as I used to have to worry about it.
Right. That's awesome, man.
It's interesting that you were talking about the quality of the paper because Brian and I were just having this conversation like a day or two ago. I was looking at a Liefeld thing and the cover was just like boom, and it was super crisp. And then I went inside and it was still newsstand or news, and I was like, oh man, it just doesn't work on this.
A lot of people have, listen, when we launched Frank Miller Presents, we put out this ash can on newsprint just for that particular reason. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to do the comparison of I printed one story that I had written for my Ancient Enemy series in the ash can on the newsprint. And then I reprinted a portion of that stories in the back of one of the other titles. Mm-hmm. And when you do the side-by-side comparison, the newsprint did okay, but the coloring gets muddy because, the paper is super absorbent. It sounds silly. I always feel funny talking about these things because I was really passionate about it. So I get really excited when I talk paper stock and things, but, but it's the subtle things that I think are essential. The good thing about newsprint is there's a smell to it that evokes comics.
True.
That hard to
Dan, that was on my mind in my next comment because I love the newsstand, and once like you guys changed to the gloss, it took away that whole experience.
No, I don't use even with Frank Miller Presents. I don't use gloss at all. Everybody switched to gloss because it was a magazine paper format. And it was plentiful at the time because it was in a magazine, so it was easy access to it. But we went to I like a matte paper. It doesn't have that sheen to it. I find it easier to read. Maybe it's because my eyes are getting old, but I think it's just better for everybody and a little more relaxing and enjoyable to read if you're not trying to read through a glare.
I think it's in between. It's in between that.
Yeah.
Brian, there was an absolute that you got for me, and I think it's a Batman, and one is on the old stock, and then the second book is on
that's year one where it does the comparison.
And to see the difference. Have you seen that one, Dan? It's in a slipcase and it's the same story, and one is printed like the original and the other one is printed on the gloss. And it's
that was Batman Year One. We did that in. You know what? We did that because David Mazzucchelli, who was the artist of that story, really focused he focused his art to work best on newsprint. So even though our Absolute was a higher end stock and paper, which is the way we provide it, because basically you have to justify the higher price points. You got to make it feel like it's more valuable. But he wanted to see it on the newsprint as it was originally intended to be published. And Mazzucchelli and Frank are guys, and there's several guys like that, but Mazzucchelli and Frank jumped to my mind right away because these are the type of guys that would actually go to the printing presses, go to where they printed the books and watch the books come offline. Pull a book or two offline just to make sure that the printing is matching what their expectations would be. So it's it's interesting. It's interesting in those days.
Cool.
That's way cool, man. I got to tell you, slow it down real quick. I met you at New York Comic Con, I think in 2016. You were like sort of kind of incognito. It was I think you were somewhere near like the LexCorp setup.
Okay.
when they were like advertising that for the BBS.
I
saw you had your Mets hat on because I'm a Mets fan too, and you had your lanyard and you were in a t-shirt and jeans, And I've seen you on enough like special features on the animated movies, and I was
Yeah.
like, Didio, and you kind of turned around, you were like by yourself, incognito, and my mom took a picture of us.
Oh, there you
So
go. Tell
yeah,
mom
that's
hi.
yeah. My mom's like, tell Dandy Dio I said hello. I
Tell her I
went.
said hi. Tell her, is she still taking you to conventions or no?
she the last one we went to was in 2017, and it's funny you say that because we're in line with Greg Capullo, and I got like 2 books for him to sign, because there was like a 2 book limit, and I'm like, here, mom, here's 2 for you. So she puts him in, and he's like, you go to these things with him, and I'm like, thanks, Greg. Yeah.
Famous story was Steve Orlando, who did some writing for us when I was there, and working on some Marvel books right now. But Steve Orlando, when he was a kid, I mean a little kid, like 10 years old, his mother would wait online and get all the books signed. And
Oh.
and everybody knew him because he was really, really loud and really anxious, and everybody knew him as the kid with his mom. So one day we're bringing Steve in for a meeting, and one of the marketing guys who ran the booth at the convention goes, "Is that the guy who brings his mom to all?" He recognized him immediately. And he so nailed him. It was hysterical. And then I heard the whole story, and it's really wonderful. He's a super nice guy too, man. So it makes it even more fun. I love stories like that. I mean, I took my own kids to the conventions. I used to go myself. I've been going. Actually, I shouldn't say that. My very first convention, I was 10 in 1970. Very first show I ever did was a show called Lunacon, and my sister took me there.
Where was that? Where was that?
That was, I think that was in the Roosevelt, or one of those hotels, mid Manhattan, one of those
Oh,
places.
I've been to I used to stay at the Roosevelt like 25 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. That
Wow.
was that was even before all the second Sundays and all that. It was the Lunacon was the predecessor to Creation conventions, which the Creation conventions were all built around Star Trek, starting in the early
Okay.
70s.
Okay.
And then you get the Phil Soulings with the second Sundays for comics, and then everything starts to move to comics after that.
All right. Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah. I still got the programs.
Oh, wow, that's great. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. I never forgot it. The guest for Lunacon, because I could check it, was Isaac Asimov and Len Wein. And actually, and funny
Wow,
thing is, I
cool.
become later down the line, several years later, decades later, I become
Yeah.
good friends with Len too. So it's just kind of funny how these things come around.
I purchased recently, I think it's like July 1980, a comics journal,
Sure.
and it has an interview. The reason I got it is an interview with John Byrne, but there's an advertisement for the San Diego Comic Con that year, and it was like, so comparatively to today, it was so
Oh,
like, it was like hand drawn, and it had the name, and it was
yeah.
like, it was just such a different world.
Oh, it
Such
is. I mean, I first learned about San Diego Comic Con because it appeared in an Iron Man comic in the early 70s.
Mhm.
And it became two things that became my holy grail was to go to a San Diego Comic Con as a kid and to
Mhm.
go to the Rutland, Vermont Halloween parade. We used to read about
Wow,
it.
that's crazy.
Yeah. I remember
That's
I remember
funny.
reading about that as a kid and going, holy shit, that's gotta be awesome.
San Diego Comic Con is on my bucket list, and
Yeah, you know what? It's worth it. Okay, I'm going to say it to you right now. It's expensive, but it's a worthwhile. It's a fun experience. I did my first one. I actually went first time I ever went. I only went once as a fan, and that was in '86. Went with my, with the family to that, and then in '94, I think it was, I started going for work first with ABC, then with Mainframe Entertainment, then with DC, and then ultimately Frank. And I did 25 years in a row of San Diego Comic Con, and I was just there this year, but it was more of a backseat I took this year. It was kind of interesting. Didn't do any panels. Actually, just went just to catch up with some folks. That was it.
Mhm.
very nice, very nice. So having mentioned Scott, having mentioned John Byrne, we've heard just through hearsay and what we've read on the internet and heard in podcasts that he's like super curmudgeonly. What
Yeah,
was your experience?
yeah. I mean, that's a hard one because I was such a monster John Byrne fan, and I
Who wasn't,
really,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just what you are. It's just there's just, even now I go through some of my old books and just I'm in awe of some of those pages and just the storytelling, and I still think honestly Burns, you can put Superman aside, but Burns wrote on Fantastic Four. Probably the best thing since, Stan and Jack. I think he truly captured the spirit of that book better than anybody, and really found a way to move it forward. I just love that to death. But yeah, you know what? Yeah, listen. When you're in a job where you're the ultimate, you're the final say. You have to make decisions, and you're constantly playing over people. You're going to constantly bang heads with everybody. And some people are good about it. Some people fight back about it. But there's a passion there that you can't. The only funny story I can tell about John Byrne is I actually went to his house in Connecticut we were pitching something, and I wanted to talk to him directly. I think it was right before the Doom Patrol launch. We were setting up Doom Patrol and trying to get that all going, and and I didn't know it. I had a staph infection from a spider bite, of all weird things. So I left his house. I felt like shit. I went straight to the hospital. So I went to the hospital. I was in the hospital for 5 days. He admitted me immediately because I had this really bad infection going on. And everybody's like going, "How'd you go from John Byrne's house to the hospital?"
Wow.
It had nothing to do with him, I don't think, unless he's the one behind the spider. That's all I know.
I love that. That's a great punchline.
Scott and I don't know if you've ever listened, if you have the time, but Rob Liefeld does his own podcast nowadays. Have you ever tuned in to Rob?
Yeah, no, I've heard enough from Rob. I don't need to see his podcast. Before joining DC, I mean, I did 20 years of TV, so I'd worked on a number of shows. I actually ran publicity for the New York-based soap operas for a few years, and all my children
like the daytime. Oh.
The daytime soaps, yeah. So I used to do all the talent appearances and a lot of things like that, and a lot of publicity with these guys. So I got a chance to learn the personalities, different from the personas, so to speak, and so it was able to. It helped me really screw my head on tight, so that when I walked into comics, that's the hard part about it. There's certain people you absolutely adore that you're at some point or another you're gonna have to fire.
Yeah.
When you think of it that way, and that's the hard part. And there was the old baseball adage that they used to use: do you trade a player 1 year too soon or 1 year too late?
Right.
And I was a 1 year too late guy on a lot of guys, and then ultimately, it winds up sort of exasperating matters because there's more frustration at that point.
Right.
You try to give everybody the best chance they can for the longest time possible, and then ultimately there's no easy way around it. There's no soft way around letting people go or moving people off, especially when they've committed themselves to a job or a character or a story, and it's tough. I mean, that's the hard part. That's the hard part of all these jobs. But at the end of the day, it's a job. It's just like anything, man. It's a job. You got to do your job. You got to find a way to balance the creative with the commerce. That's the hardest part of all these positions.
How did you transition from television and whatnot over into comics?
You know what? I would listen. I'm one of those guys. I always love comics. I have rejection letters dating back to probably 1978, when I first submitted my first stories to Marvel and DC. I enjoy creating as much as I enjoy writing. As long as I'm part of the creative process and able to contribute, that gives me the same amount of satisfaction of creating it myself, to be honest.
Got it. Yeah. Cool.
So for me, it was interesting. So I was submitting work in the beginning because I love comics. I was submitting material. Then I was working in TV, and then I still enjoyed comics. Along the way, in mid 80s, I become friends with Jimmy Palmiotti. We actually lived in the same building in Brooklyn together. Struck a friendship up. We wound up submitting materials together. Ultimately, we wind up getting the Superboy gig together. But in the process at the same time, I had been doing writing for I was helping some guys doing publicity, the press releases for them, because that was one of my jobs in TV. And then also I was doing some writing for some magazines. I did some work for Wizard along the way. I did some work for a couple other guys. There was a company called I want to say it was Great Eastern. They did a comic book week. It was a new weekly comic newspaper, and I was doing some writing for them on that, which is a lot of fun.
Say the name again for me.
Comic Book Week. I think it was put out by Great Eastern Conventions. A guy by the name of, I want to say Bob Green. No, it's not Bob Greenberg. Some Fred Greenberg, maybe something like that. But I had done some. So I done a lot. I always kept my fingers in the pie. So while I was working at TV, so as the story goes, I was working for a computer animation company. I was living in New Jersey, had an office in LA, and the main office was in Vancouver. And I was on a plane 3 weeks out of every month, flying around.
Sure.
Flew out of Newark Airport on September 11th, 2001. Got stuck in Canada because the borders got shut down. So I was on a plane in air while everything was going on. Landed in Canada, realized probably I don't want to fly as much as I've been doing. So as the story goes, I like to tell stories. As the story goes, I had a good friend of mine who was president of Warner Animation. And I was going to meet with him because I wanted to see if there were opportunities or animation companies on the East Coast. So I go to meet him for dinner, true story. And he's sitting there with Paul Levitz. And he goes to me, Dan, Paul's looking for somebody with comic book knowledge, but outside experience. He goes, you have outside experience and you have comic knowledge. He goes, why don't you two have dinner together? I'm going to go to a different table and meet my friends over there. He had another meal set up. So I always tell people that I got my first opportunity to work for DC through a blind date with Paul Levitz.
That's cool.
and then basically I did about 6 interviews with Paul. He didn't have a job in mind for me. And then basically they created this rather ubiquitous position called VP of Editorial, which really didn't have much authority, not much responsibility, but sort of my job was to kibitz and get in the way and mix it up a little bit. They were trying to find a way to shake up the interior of it. So over the first year, I was really trying to help coordinate between Vertigo and DC and Mad and find a way to get talent and find a way to promote the material and really learn the infrastructure. So I spent about a year learning the infrastructure of DC so well that after the end of that first year, I wanted to leave. But on my way out, I explained, Paul, this is what I think you should do. And I gave him a couple suggestions. I gave him some ideas about how I think that you should reorganize and restructure the departments for some levels of efficiency that I think might be able to have it. And basically, he said, I'm going to take all your recommendations, but I need you to make couple of changes, but one major change. I said, what's that? He goes, I'd like you to take the executive editor position, charge of DC. And
About what year was
going to
that?
head back into animation at that moment. And
what year was that?
I would say probably beginning of 2003, probably around there. Yeah, right around there. So yeah, because I joined in January, February 2002. So I had a 1-year deal. My deal was ending, and that was the end of my first year. So that was when I was moving over. So anyway, he said that to me, and I'm going to say this to you guys because you probably get what I'm going to say here. Do you know when you're a little kid, you want to be like an astronaut or this or that, and you have all these job ideas, and you ultimately wind up whatever you wind up doing. I always wanted to be Stan Lee.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
I always wanted to be that guy who could climb up on a table and yell orders about how to fix things and do all these things with comic book characters and ideas and shoot ideas off and be crazy about all that stuff. So when you're offered that position, and I had such respect for so many people that had done that jobs before, and honestly, I went into a job, I'll be honest with you, now I can say this now, I can probably say it even now because of the same reason. I wasn't qualified for the position. Everybody that had that job prior to me had spent, a decade or two, learning it from ground up in different positions in some sort of creative or executive or editorial position beforehand. And I'm coming from the outside, attacking it from the top down rather than the bottom up.
Yeah, but I think it's super interesting. As I'm hearing your story, the fact that a position that was created for you was probably a blessing, and to just kind of see how the machine worked
and challenge it constantly. I mean, I was there to challenge everything. That's the truth, and I did, because at that point I had no allegiances, no alliances, and also I couldn't. My very first function was canceling. My very first decision at DC was to cancel the book that Jimmy and I were writing. And I had to call Jimmy up, who got me the job, to write with him on Superboy and tell him the first thing I'm doing is canceling Superboy.
How did that go?
He's a true friend. How about that?
Okay.
True friend.
Yeah.
He understood it. It's, also I had known Jimmy and Joe very well from their event comics days as well. I helped them a little bit with them. I did some of the press releases I did. I worked with them a little bit. So I knew all these guys. Jimmy, I actually had Jimmy, Amanda, and I believe Mark Wade I actually had working for me when I was at ABC Children's Television. I was in charge of the development for ABC Saturday Morning, and I had brought those guys in. I had optioned Gatecrasher. Oh no, I'm sorry. Gatecrasher is when I was at Mainframe. Gatecrasher we optioned at Mainframe, and we actually had it in development over at Fox and almost got it made. So they've worked with me on several levels. We've known each other for a long time. So you can have hard conversations with it. But the most important thing about Jimmy is Jimmy's a professional, top to bottom. So it's a lot easier to have those conversations who approach things from both a creative and business sense. So it's a lot easier to be able to talk to them rationally about how you're making certain decisions.
Yeah. Jimmy and I follow each other on Twitter, and he seems like a real salt of the earth type guy.
Yeah. I've known him a long time. Probably one of the people I know the best and trust the most.
Wow,
Okay.
that's fun. I love learning the history and the mechanics of all this stuff.
Can I say something? That it's funny you say that. I was that kid when I said I want to be Stanley. That's rather just a rather superficial explanation. I was the kid that when the comics came out at the end of the year, I would write down all the sales numbers. You remember they used to have the box in the back and they used to break down the sales numbers because they had to list it all when they were on the newsstand. I would actually write down those numbers and create my own lists about what sold and didn't sell. I was fascinated by the behind the scenes of comics more so than the actual making of the comics in some ways, the comics themselves. I found that more fascinating, and I'm more interested in meeting the people who are behind the curtain than in front of the curtain, and one of the fun things that Paul did for me when I was there during that year as the VP of editorial, he set up meetings with me for me, like, almost like little classes. Granted, he was the big teacher that I spoke to the most, but he brought Julie Schwartz in to sit with me for a day. Dick Giordano came in for a day. So I'm meeting, and then I would sit down with the heads of all the different departments. As annoying as I was.
That's super cool. I mean, that's like such a privilege.
And it was fascinating.
It's great to have a super powerful mentor, someone who's super invested.
It's also, what else? It's what's lacking right now is that sense of history. And it's not the sense of history just to sit here and just say, oh, this is my favorite Superman story. Oh, this is the way it had to be when it was done back in the 60s. It's a sense of understanding why decisions were made.
Right.
And one of my, and that's why I always look at Jeanette Kahn's run, and if you look at Jeanette Kahn's run of DC Comics, she came in, and I felt a kinship to her in a way I can't even explain it. Plus, I actually knew Jeanette before I was even at DC. She was the one person I knew when I worked at ABC. I was developing Metal Men with her as an animated series. So, but Jeanette, she's the one I always had this wild respect for, just because she was a woman walking into this situation. She was not welcomed in the door. She had a point of view, and she attacked it. And then if you think, she gets in about 76, right? And then you get that DC implosion in 78, which could knock anybody out of any job. You know what I mean? You're cutting 40% of your staff, 40% of your books. The entire line collapses. You're not even sure if you're staying in business. Okay. Oh. And instead, they bounce back. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, the reaction to this collapse and this quote unquote failure of the line results into what becomes arguably DC's greatest moment in the 80s, with everything that happens there. So it's taking failure and learning from it and turning it into success down the road. And the one thing I learned from that is that you never stop taking risks. You don't, ever. Because first of all, the risks you're making aren't that big. And we used to have an expression in a meeting: when we make a mistake at DC, nobody dies. It's like, we don't have a job where if you make a mistake, somebody actually dies. It's, you screw up a character for a month. That's okay. Next issue, we put out a book, all's forgiven, all's forgotten. We move on.
Yeah.
But you can't weigh that like every decision be this make or break of your life on this, and a lot of people put that weight on the characters. And I used to say the characters are not porcelain. They are diamonds. And the goal is you can play with a diamond, you can bang it around because it's a diamond, it could take the stress. You're not going to break it. And if you do break it, it doesn't stay broken for long. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Sure,
that makes a lot of sense.
Well, Jeanette's the one who brought Frank over. Right?
Yeah, Janet brought Frank over, but also opened up the gates for that whole British invasion. She knew she had to change what DC, how DC acted, behaved, and perceived, and I think it's really this moment in time. The other moment in time that I love is when Carmine Infantino takes over. Okay, and when Carmine Infantino takes over, it's the late '60s. Now, here's the funny part, because it's again a massive failure. You come in and you have these 40-plus-year-old men trying to connect with the cultural shift and hippie movement that's happening in the late 60s, early 70s. And Marvel seems to catch that wave a little bit better than DC, primarily because they brought in a lot of young writers and talent that really were part of that generational shift. So they caught the wave and they rode it. DC's taking writers and artists that were existing for 20 years before that and trying to do their interpretation of that wave. So where you're seeing things happening over at Marvel, you're getting Hawk and Dove, The Creeper, Plastic Man, Metamorpho. You're getting all these Brother Power the Geek, all these weird attempts at trying to connect with a younger generation, but yet failing immediately. All those books, none of them makes it past 6 issues. Maybe Plastic Man lasts the longest. But they tried new things. And ultimately, those new things became somebody's favorite. And then 20 years later, that person's now writing. They remember the thing they love, and they're finding a way to reinvent it and make it new for a new audience, and it grows on. So that was my argument again at DC. Keep on trying new. Stop relying on the old. Even if it doesn't work, it's okay to fail, because you might make it into somebody's favorite down the road, and then it becomes something else 10 years from now. But you're planting seeds. You're working the fertile earth. If you just keep on tilling that same soil, you're gonna run out of gas. You're gonna run out. It's not gonna be able to grow. So it's always important to constantly refresh that line.
Yeah, man. You're not like excited about any of this or anything.
What's that?
You're not excited about this at all or anything, are you?
Nah. It's old news. Did the
super super appreciate your zeal, man. You're just like all over it.
You still got it. Like your energy is such, and your enthusiasm, like you could jump right back in the spot.
Yeah, it's okay. It's fun to talk about it. You know what? Can I say something?
Please.
Probably see the enthusiasm and energy, because in the past you're always very much in a box a little bit. As an executive, you're in a box, so you can't really, present all sides of the story. You have a very focused message about what you got to say.
But the thing that I also appreciate, though, is you're not just talking about your tenure, your time there. You obviously have a lot of context. You're talking about the prehistory, if you will, and you know about it. And so you came into this like, man, I'm all in. I'm going to do this thing. And
no. One of the things I did during that first year, I actually put a thesis together for Paul as part of my interview process.
Wow.
Breaking down the first 5 years of Marvel, of how they built the Marvel universe.
Oh wow.
And that was a blast, because the Marvel universe was built off of several things happening at the same time. You got to, first of all, you got to realize the Marvel Universe was only about 14 books. So it's a lot easier to manage the talent and keep the levels high when you're only managing 14 books.
Okay.
During my time at DC, at the height, DC Universe alone, just DC Universe alone, was turning out 70 titles a month. Wow. 70. Wow. So how do you maintain a quality level when you're doing it at that level? It's just as people say, I'm surprised these books aren't good. It's something about surprised this book is bad, and I'm more surprised books were good, because just the sheer volume of things are turning out. Sooner or later you're going to hit one or two. Right. But the reality is Marvel was very tight line, so they stuck with characters, and they changed the stories if the characters weren't working. They just didn't end it. They just tried to find a way to keep it going. DC parent company, one of the companies that was owning DC, actually controlled the distribution, so they limited the amount of Marvel books. That's why you got the split books, because they couldn't introduce more characters. And once Marvel got its own distribution plan, then they were able to split all those books, and everybody got their own titles. Okay. But the famous moment in history, from what I understand, as I was explained to me, was the moment when they kept on jacking the prices up. So they went from 12 to 15. They knew they had to go up again. There was not collusion, but they had a conversation about how they were all going to jump to 25 cents, and DC jumped to 25 cents. Remember those extra books?
And do the more pages, right?
Do the more pages, exactly, in order to justify the price. Marvel said they would do in time the same thing. So DC went with the plan, and Marvel did it for 1 month and then went down to 20.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens, and that's the moment Marvel passes DC. Because ultimately what happens is you could buy 5 Marvel books for the same price as 4 DC books at that moment. And all of a sudden, people are grabbing more Marvels because they got that one extra book for their buck. And all of a sudden they never look back since. And
What year would that have been about?
It's gotta be like, I want to say 71, 72.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. Was it 20, 25 cents? Yeah. We've heard about that. And that's an interesting thing. I never knew about it until recently. It was like,
yeah, it was, but DC being DC, they went with the plan. They saw Marvel went back to 20 cents, went down to 20, but DC said, nope, we're sticking with it. And they stayed with it for 2 years and they never recovered. Never recovered.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pricing.
Well, you mentioned risks before. As much as you're willing to say about the current state of comics, because my personal opinion, excuse me, my personal opinion of comics is, since you were deposed, and Bob Harris as well, and it seems, at least in my mind, it seems like there's a bunch of editors who are younger, inexperienced, who are just drowning in doing way too many books because of whatever the cost cutting is, whatever's going on right now, when AT&T to Discovery, and now they're just like throwing poop at Velcro, like, oh, this character is gay, this character is bisexual, this character is not, to try and sell comics, as opposed to you. I don't remember you pulling gimmicks like that. You were always going for a story.
Yeah, I mean, listen, everything, I always say, tell me the story first. People say to me, oh, they did this, they did that. And I said, I can't really comment on it because I have no idea what the story's about. It is the action justified in the story? The worst thing anybody could do, and I had a couple of writers that were very, very much along this line. They used to throw in something sensational like the bomb, and then, and then all of a sudden they would either discount it or undo it within the next 15 seconds. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to let you do this event, which is going to create a hornet's nest, unless there's a reason for it, the long-term justification. And, I always said, you explain to me what the long-term plan is, and I get behind you. And I got behind, look, when you're in charge of a line, like I said, you can get up to 70 books a month. You're not going to create everything you like. It's impossible. And absolutely wrong to do that, by the way. Not even impossible. Shouldn't be done. Nothing should be driven on one taste, one flavor the whole way through. So you're going to wind up producing books that you despise, because that's the way it has to be. You just have to understand it for craft, you know what I mean? And for purpose, It's funny because I can tell you, I saw the Barbie movie. Did I like it? I don't know. But I was more interested in the craft of making it. And you walk in for a movie that's called Barbie, you know what you're going to get. And if you don't get that, then that's a mistake. So they achieved their goal, in my opinion. So again, tell me what your goal is for your book. And if you achieve it, I'll support it. But if you can't achieve it and you're just doing it for doing it, then that's not right.
If you can't explain it.
What?
If you can't explain it even up front.
It's not even that. But again, the goal is, the main goal is you're putting out books every month. If you come to a conclusion or a story which forces everything to restart or to change, or it goes nowhere, then you're not feeding the beast, I used to call it. You got to feed the beast. You got to create stories that give me more stories. Give me a story here that I get 5 other stories out of, or a year's worth of story out of here, because it's exhausting having to come up with new stuff all the time. And if not, you're just going to have to go back to the same pot and rehash old shit again. So the only way you can push it forward is you find a way to create stories that build on each other, so it keeps the machine running,
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
What do you think of current comics then? I assume you're keeping some sort of tabs on certain.
Not real. Actually, you'd be surprised how much I'm not.
Really?
Yeah.
So passionate about it and so informed, and you're writing comics.
It's a weird thing for me, It's I think it's a personality trait in a very strange way. When I worked in animation, I knew every cartoon that was on the air with every creative team and who was writing it. As soon as I got out of cartoons, couldn't name a show that was on the air. Okay. When I worked in soap operas, I knew every actor on every show. I knew every storyline. I knew what was going on. I knew everything about them inside and out. As soon as I left soap operas, I knew nothing about it. It's almost like there's a certain capacity to the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Purpose driven. You're purpose driven.
Yeah, and so for me, it's like, I'm doing this stuff with Frank, but quite honestly, I've got to. This is my moment to take all the little notes that I made to myself about things that I wanted to do and starting to organize them. And it's taken a little while to do it, but I got a novel out. They call it my pandemic baby. I always wanted to write a prose novel. I was able to get that done, which I feel good about. I got that out. We launched the Frank Miller Presents line, and even though it's only a couple of books, when you're doing soup to nuts, which is what I wanted to do, it's a lot more time consuming and a lot more exhausting. And now all my attention is on the details. Like, I screwed up barcodes. How do you fuck up barcodes, man? You know what I mean? Things that you took for granted in the other position. Now you're sitting there going, I got to write solicitation copy again. I got to get barcodes information. What's it? What, it's crazy. It's crazy. But it's a different business. I mean, let me put it this way. I was writing solicits for one of the Diamond catalogs, and I was struggling. And I literally wrote the DC employee who'd handled that for years at DC and made it look so effortless. And I just said, listen, man, I owe you. I don't know how you did this on a monthly basis for as many books as you did and didn't lose your mind, because I'm only doing 3 titles and I'm losing my mind. Just because you forget that all the detail and minutia is what's essential for everybody else, for tracking these books and for selling these books and all this other stuff behind the scenes. So that's what consumes me now, is making sure I did it. Considering that we inauspiciously launched Frank Miller Presents, the first 2 books we put out didn't have prices on them.
Oh boy.
I did my first 2 books. I was working with one designer in one part of the world and a pre-press team in another part of the world. And the pre-press team's responsible for the barcode. The designer's responsible for the design. Mm-hmm. Pre-press team thought the designer put the price on. The designer thought the pre-press team put it in the barcode. So it slips through. I'm at a retailer summit, Diamond Retailer Summit in Baltimore, proofing the book on my phone, checking it on my phone, and in between meetings, and it looked fine to me on my phone.
Yeah.
And then when we went to do Pandora, I used a different team, and then that team calls me up and goes, "Hey, are we leaving prices off the books for a reason?"
Oh man!
I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, there's no prices on your books." He goes, "Is that my choice?" And I'm like, "No." No, I'm not that crazy.
Well, it's not like you necessarily have a playbook on that,
Yeah,
like step by step.
It's like I said, but it's, for me, if you really want to do comics, you got to sort of, like I said, I sort of started at the top and now I'm working my way down. So now I'm doing all the nuts and bolts stuff, and it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, it sounds like you're having a good time, which is cool.
It's work. It keeps you busy.
No, you look vibrant and like refreshed.
It's all you know what? It's at the end of the day, it's comic books, man. That's all I gotta say. And I still get excited when I'm working on a book and the page comes in and the art excites me, or it's better than I thought it was going to be. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's so, and I'm working with Frank Miller, so I see Frank Miller pages come in, and Daniel Enriquez is working with Frank on a book right now on one of the issues of Ronin, and he's doing this interesting ink and tone on him that's different than you've seen Frank's art before. So it's been fun because we're still trying different things. And listen, it's a tough business right now. You're asking me about comics. Comics is in tough shape. Okay. Yeah. Let's cut to the real chase. If you want to look at it, I can talk about, we can sit here and argue about about the creative is or whatever is that. But let's talk about the reality. The reality is the concept of the Wednesday Warrior is dead, which is the scariest thing of all. That was the one thing that we all counted upon as the given, meaning there's this set group of fans that are going to come in every Wednesday because they had to get their comic book fix, and that was our base, and everything else was gravy on top of that. Yeah. So when the Wednesday Warrior dies, and it's not just I'm angry at you because you took off Superman's shorts. It's not that crowd anymore. It's something different going on. There's a different ambivalence, because I always said I know how to deal with a happy fan. I always know how to deal with a sad, angry fan. What I can't deal with, and the one I don't know, is the ambivalent fan, the one who gives up and just walks away quietly and disappears.
Said nothing. Yeah, just done.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you don't know they're gone until they're gone, and when they're gone. And I think one of the most interesting things I've been hearing, and this is a fascinating one for me. I've been hearing from retailers about buying collections. And I hear about people buying collections a lot. And I hear more and more about it. I just bought a new collection here or there. And what I'm getting and what we're getting from this is that the fans aren't just quitting. They're quitting. Like, they're selling their books, quitting. You know, like, I'm out. Like, this is not part of my life anymore. And that's horrible. You know what I'm saying? Because once you have that out, you better have a new audience built to replace it. And you don't right now. What happened is, and I'll say this, and I'll argue these points, I believe we've lost maybe 1 to 2 generations of readers over the last decade to manga, because there's something that they're reading there that they're not getting in the main books, that the superhero books are not giving them. And then you can go in, is that art? Is it storytelling? Is it excitement? Is it this? What is it that's not working? And, you know, my other argument always used to be, when people came to me and said, how do you look at Marvel as your competition? I said, Marvel's not my competition. You know, as Marvel goes, DC goes. You know what I'm saying? We're always fighting. We're always jockeying. You get 1 or 2 books high, but at the end of the day, strong Marvel and DC is a strong comic business. Right. That's because that's how the system is built. The system is built on Marvel and DC. That's it. You can talk about every other company. That's great. Everybody's doing a wonderful job. Marvel and DC is where it's at. If Marvel and DC doesn't work, the comics, collectors, direct market business does not work. Okay? Simple. So ultimately what happens is, when Marvel and DC is not working, everybody's trying to fix everything else around the sides, but it's not going to be able to make the difference. And ultimately, Marvel and DC are not connecting with an audience. I think because there's so many other ways to get that superhero fix in so many other forms, that if the books don't hold your interest, you can move to something else. And that's why I always consider the movie and TV my competition and not Marvel. Because if Marvel, and that's why I hate, and people know this, I could say this out loud, I hate books like the books that are derivative of the TV shows, or the TV shows telling us the direction, telling us in DC at the time when I was there, the direction to move our characters, because DC Comics should be in charge of the IP. They should choose the direction. They should set the course.
Agreed.
As soon as the movie said it, or the TV show said it, or anybody else sets it, the comics become irrelevant, because that's not what's leading the creative charge. Other people leaving. You've ceded your authority. You've now become a licensee of your own character, which is the worst.
I think that's wow. I have not had that thought. I think that's super powerful and makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of weight to put on that. And so, you know, all the stuff that's happened with the films and stuff has definitely impacted the way comics are perceived. So very insightful. I really appreciate that.
And the saddest thing I can tell you about the comics business right now is there are 2 things driving the business: speculators and variant covers. Speculators thinking a comic, number 1 comics can become Walking Dead number 1 because it's some TV show. So you sell number 1, and then number 2 sells at 60% to 40% of the number 1 number, and then it gets cut again until you're grinding at the bottom, and then you're relaunching to push that artificial number 1 high. And the overabundance of variant covers, which I don't even know how it sustained itself this long. I mean,
you could go back 30 years on that conversation. Really.
Oh yeah, no. Listen, I've been arguing with this. I always say, every year I say the variant cover business is going to implode, and 1 year I might be right.
Oh man, crazy.
Dan, I would like you, please, and appreciate all your sharing. These are gems. Thank you so much. Can you tell us how Identity Crisis came about? How did Identity Crisis come about?
Yeah, absolutely. Brad Meltzer,
20th anniversary too.
Yeah, no, Identity Crisis, honestly, in some ways, I consider that the start of what I wanted DC Comics to be. So that's why it was important to me. Couple of things. Number 1 is Brad was working on Green Arrow, I think. I think he was on Green Arrow. I
Mhm.
want to say he's
After Kevin Smith, yeah.
and he was working. I think he might have been working with Mike Carlin, editor, and he had the idea for Identity Crisis. He pitched it, and it was so dramatic that I knew we had to do it. I wanted to because part of his okay. I have to go backwards 5 seconds, and then we're going to go forward again. Okay, the backwards different. I always have to explain difference between Marvel and DC. Marvel and DC difference is proactive, reactive. Okay. Marvel characters reactive. I just want to live my life. I want to be normal. And all these villains come in and attack me. I get my powers. I don't want them. I'm trying to stop it from happening. I just want to be a regular person, and it just keeps on affecting my regular life. Okay, reactive. DC characters, proactive. I get a power. You know what? I got to stop crime. I got to put on a costume. I got to go on patrol. I got to do all these things that are extraordinarily proactive instead of just accepting something changed with me and then trying to make it work within the normal parameters of how I live. They immediately try to become heroes. So as soon as you have that and everybody doing the same thing, it sort of becomes homogenous in regards to what everybody's motivations are, because ultimately they're all trying to do good. So my big goal was to challenge the interpretation of doing good within DC Comics. And I said, if everyone's going to go out on patrol as soon as they get powers, and that makes them homogenous, then the only way I can differentiate between my heroes is give them different motivations on why they're going on patrol and what they're trying to stop and how they're going to do it. And that's how we created differentiation between who our heroes were, because each one of them was doing what they believed to be the greater good. But ultimately, it was their interpretation of the greater good, which in that sense puts them in odds with somebody else. You know, you could sit and look at today's political environment, and everybody's going to climb up on a table and scream at each other about how much they're going to make America better. And they couldn't be further apart, but I can guarantee you both of them think that they're 100% correct in making America better.
Yes.
You know, so take that same logic and apply it to superheroes. We're going to make the world safer. How are you going to make it safer? And then you challenge them in that fashion, and then you get a story. Identity Crisis was the start of that. It showed that the heroes thought and approached things differently. It gave them more personality.
Super powerful. I know very little about DC. I was probably semi Marvel zombie as a kid, and Brian has been schooling me. And so that was one of the first DC things that he had me read when we first started the show a year ago. And I was just like, whoa, amazing. Absolutely amazing. And then to hear you break it down the way you just did, it's like, makes so much sense.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I always joke about this. Everybody thinks that you're making decisions in a vacuum. You know, you're making things overact, you know what I mean? And off the top of your head. Farthest thing from the truth. It's a lot of thought and conversation that goes into everything before it gets made. Ultimately, it all is up front. So when it's executed, sometimes it's on track, sometimes it's off track, sometimes it's nothing even remotely similar to what you like. That's sort of the dice you roll when you're putting out that many books. Sort of what happens. Mm-hmm. With Identity Crisis, though, because it was so dramatic and we knew going to be so controversial, what Brad did brilliantly was he wrote the entire thing before we even drew it.
Okay.
So everybody had a chance to read the story. So you're not just reacting to a scene, you have everything in context. Mm-hmm. The worst thing you can do is take these projects, these pages out of context and blow them up to be something that it's not. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, by seeing the whole book in behind it, we went. And then what I did at that time too, at that point too, DC had a very poor relationship with Wizard Magazine. Wizard Magazine, arguably the most influential magazine at that early 2000s with comics. I gave them the entire script, all six parts, seven. Really? 6 parts of the start, it became seven. Really? Gave them all the scripts, and I said, "Here's the story." And they connected with it in such a way they knew it was going to be dramatic point, and they got behind it, and we created a juggernaut with it. And ultimately, it set the tone. And from those scenes, as I told you, stories build stories. The Batman story gets me to the OMEC project that gets me into Infinite Crisis. You know, all these things start happening that starts to feed out. And what I used to do, and I still have copies of it, I've got what I used to call the manifesto. Every year I would create a manifesto. I'd be talking to the editors, be talking to the writers, listening to what everybody has to say. and then I built a big arcing story every year of what the DCU should be for that year. Not anywhere particular, not one character story, just what's happening across that. And what that did, it eliminated similarities of people doing similar stories with no connection. It gave me contact points. And then I built every quarter a moment that is shared across the DC universe that everybody would refer to. So that way we had connectivity and continuity by 6 degrees of separation, because everybody was referring to an event that ties into it. And the goal was always one Superman book had to tie in, always one Batman book had to tie in. And then if that one book ties to the other Superman books, all Superman books are tied in through association, all the Batman books are tied into association. Right. And then you get this sense of this shared universe that was able to drive this monolithic story forward, and the probably the best example of that is from Countdown to Infinite Crisis all the way to the end of the 52 weekly series. That was one of the big arcs that was laid out over a 3-year plan.
Wow, that's super cool,
dude. That's so awesome. Thank you for that. I don't know if you remember this, but I watch it every now and then from time to time. Is on the special features for Crisis on Two Earths.
Yeah,
when they talk to you and Brad and Rags about Identity Crisis, and Brad was like, "Oh no, wait till you see what happens in the next one," and you're like, "No, I can't wait. I need to know. To know." And that's when he told you about Batman getting mind wiped, and you're like, "I love it." I thought that was a great. That's like one of my favorite things to watch about that, and how the whole world changed after 9/11, and like people with machine guns at the subway and all this. So
well, it was the world changed. It was a different place. There was more anxiety, more anxiousness in it, and we had to be reflective of the times. Mm-hmm. There was an adage that I desperately had to break at DC, and the adage was, if there's a pop culture trend and DC jumps on it, that usually means it's over. and I always laugh because DC put out its 9/11 book a year after everybody else's, still just as important, but it was important for me to capture what was in the zeitgeist of pop culture and in the world, to make sure that we felt relevant and in contact and in relationship with what was going on there at all times.
See, now that story was like my Watchmen, where I was like, oh my gosh, superheroes do this? Like, I felt like they were in the real world with me. And I go back and I read it probably almost once a year, the story. And I still get chills at certain points in the story. Like, I wish that DC would go back to this. Like, this is what I dig. And I feel like everything now is of a lighter fare. It's trying, again, it's like throwing poop at Velcro.
Well, you got to realize that came in, and I was coming against the lighter fare at that time. At that time, when I walked in the door, Justice League was a bit of a joke. They had the goofy Justice League, and I always talk to Keith Giffen about this too, and it's an interesting conversation, because Keith goes, Justice League International, he goes, everybody knows Justice League International as a joke book. He goes, it wasn't a joke book when it was created. He goes, it's a dark comic with light humor to break up the dark points. And if you read those early Justice League Internationals with Giffen, DeMatteis, and McGuire, it's pretty heavy shit in there. Okay. It's not till later that people only remember the gags, and they build on the gags. The teams that take over from Keith and team, they build on the gag portion, and they blow that out to the point that it becomes a little bit more of a joke book. So you have that, and then you have Young Justice, which is also a very light book. And there's a lot of stuff very light happening in the DC universe, and nothing was landing with any appreciable weight or energy. And that's one of the reasons why, I felt we needed something that really made a statement to say the DC universe is not a safe place anymore. It's as dangerous as the world you're living in. But this world that we have has heroes, but we got to watch these heroes too.
Right. How do you feel to this day? Because especially in this political environment, everybody comes out with the Me Too of, oh, I don't like Identity Crisis because women were depicted such and such a way. What do you think of the backlash? Because I think it's bogus.
I think they have to read the story first before they make that comment. Because anybody who makes that comment knows that I know for a fact they didn't read the comic book. Well, I know that for a fact.
Like I listened to some podcasts of guys who were like, oh, the story was ambitious, but I didn't like that there was a rape scene. And, they've even said like, oh, DC wanted a rape scene and they forced it on Brad Meltzer, and I'm like, I don't.
Yeah, that's the furthest thing in the world.
Yeah.
We needed something that was strong and powerful.
Right.
And what I'll always say is that whoever says that, ask them if they like Watchmen.
Right. Right.
That's all I ask. Just ask them if they like Watchmen, because they have to be. People need to be consistent in their statements. If somebody says they didn't like Identity Crisis because there was rape in it, then obviously they didn't like Watchmen either. And if they say that, then I'll listen to what they have to say. But if they think Watchmen is still the premier book, then I have to question where the motivation.
Dude, I appreciate that 100%. That's going to be my blowback, because I hear it way too much when people talk about Identity Crisis.
Yeah, no, it's Identity Crisis is one of the strongest, well-told stories that we had.
And I absolutely agree.
You know, and I stood by Brad by that. We all stood by Brad by that. The team was there, fully supportive, and we knew we were doing something for us. It was important for what we wanted to accomplish with the line. And you know, for Brad to stand out there and to tell that book, not many people could tell that book as strong and as well as he did. And I think that's what counts the most, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then when you mentioned about countdown to, what was it, Infinite Crisis, when Blue Beetle got his brains blown out by Max Lord, dude, I was like, wow. I was working to that scene. That was the scene I had in my head from day one. I knew the concept was, we have all these heroes, and you're in the world of Superman, you know, and everybody thinks they're invulnerable. They're not. And sometimes you're just not good enough. And in this case, being a hero, if you're not good enough, you could die, you know? And that's the thing. But I think the greatest compliment I get on that book is people tell me, I'm a Blue Beetle fan. And he says, that's the best Blue Beetle story I ever read, except for the last page. I agree.
You know what I mean? Because we wanted to show him to be smartest, the one most driven. He kept on going on. Everybody kept on pushing him aside and ignoring him. Yes, he kept going because he was a hero in his heart, and he figured it out. He solved it, and he died because of it. You know, and that was a big moment for me. That was so important. I can't tell you. And then you look at the ramifications of that death and how long it plays out. And I think that's important too. You know,
I still have that dread, that existential dread reading the story, even though I know what's going to happen.
Oh, I love that book. That's I had edited a Lobo series by getting there just to understand the process of editing for comics. But that was my first hands-on, sleeves up, on top of every page editing scene on that book. And actually, Brad had a hand in that too. He helped on some of the dialogue as well. He came in. What I love about that book, pulling back for a second, is it was a team effort. Judd, Greg, Jeff, the artists, everybody. It was a team book. Everybody had one goal in mind, just to make the best comic possible. They weren't worried about who was going to upstage each other. These guys were craftsmen and put their concerns and their interests in the superhero line first and tell the best stories possible. And too much is about being said about my version of this and my version of that these days, you know? And the reality is it's the character. You should be talking characters first. It's not about your version. Everybody working on these superhero characters, we're all renters, you know, we're all renters, you know, that's the only way I look at it. You know, we're there. And, you know, Paul said it to me. He said, you play with them as much as you want, you know, break them as much as you want. But when you put them back in the box, I want you to put them back the way you found them.
Yes. I remember I think he said it on, I don't know if it was that special feature, but there was one of them I listened to, and he said that. Yeah. Same exact thing. Thank you.
Now, that was my pitch.
Now, building from Countdown, then what you guys did next, where Wonder Woman broke Maxwell Lord's neck.
That was always planned too.
Man, Dan, like, that part was like, I get it 100%. It makes perfect sense, because he's mind controlling Superman, and Superman is, you know, all these things. And
again, I remember I told you we do something quarterly, so it went. I might be forgetting something, so forgive me. We killed Blue Beetle. That was the big moment that fed the stories. Death of Max Lord fed the stories. Explosion of the Watchtower and Martian Manhunter fed the stories. and then the launch of Infinite Crisis. That was the 1 year run up.
I loved it.
It was a goal. You always got to put something again. Pull this again. If you tie everything together endlessly, it gets tedious and boring because everybody's doing the same thing.
Right.
But I looked at it as this weird accordion. It's like push all the stories together, give them time to breathe. Push them together, give them time to breathe. And at the end of the day, you got a polka. Hopefully, a good song. But
well, that was also around the time. Correct me if I'm wrong. That was also around the time when there was one of my absolute favorite Batman stories, Fugitive and Murderer, or Murderer and Fugitive.
Right beforehand. It's before it. Yeah, right around that. Yeah.
Right, because Sacha Bordeaux got involved with Checkmate, and then Checkmate played a role in.
Yeah, Sacha was a favorite of Greg Rucka's, so he made sure that she always found a home in one of his stories. It's like having your favorite actor work in the movies all the time. That was one of his favorite actors.
I love it. I wish Rucka would actually, if he ever came back.
Rucka is one of the true craftsmen in the business and selfless craftsman. He put his body out on the tracks every chance he can for the success of the line and success of the books. I can't speak highly enough about him either, man. Just amazing job. Just a decent, great person.
That's cool.
Yeah, he seems like it. I love his writing. His writing is fantastic. Yeah. I've yet to get to my Gotham Central omnibus, but I'm super excited to read it. I've heard glowing reviews, and I always loved with him. And like I look now, and it's like, wow. At one point, DC had Brubaker and Rucka writing Batman and Gotham Central. That's
the strength of Denny O'Neil. Denny brought a lot of those guys in.
Yeah.
They had their own little boot camp in Batman. I sort of brought the Batman team into the rest of the DC universe. I didn't like the camps they had. I didn't like the sense there was a Batman camp and a Superman camp and a Justice camp. It's DC. We shouldn't be competing with each other. We should be working with each other.
Agreed. Now, I just want to hit you with 2 or 3 questions, listener questions that were sent to us. I have a few. I think Scott might have 1 or 2. So
if you don't mind, guys, I got a hard out at 8:30. If that's okay, it's just a couple of minutes here. So
no, yeah. I'm gonna. Okay. Thank you. No, thank you.
You run with your stuff, Ray.
Okay, super appreciative of you, Dan. So it says, can you share your favorite unique take on Batman that you encountered and what made it stand out to you?
My favorite unique take on Batman was when Grant Morrison did Dick Grayson as Batman with Damian Wayne. Because what I found interesting is Grant took the paradigm of Batman and flipped it. So what was good is that most time people write somebody else in the bat suit and they act the same way Bruce Wayne does. So there's no appreciable difference than if it's Bruce or not. But what Grant did, he took the Dick Grayson personality and kept the lighter interpretation of that character and put in the Batman suit. But to keep the grim aspect, he made Damian the grim version. So you had a grim Robin and a light Batman. So you got the same dynamic, but the paradigm was flipped between the 2 characters. I thought that was fascinating because it was a way to take what the expectation was for the dynamic duo team, but flip it in a way that felt new, but worked within your understanding of who they were.
Well, thank you for that. Okay. And then lastly,
pretty cool.
The decision for that was approved for Jason Todd to come back to life.
Oh, that's an easy one. Sales.
So what happened? God pitched you the idea and you're like, I think it'll
What happened was Hush, you have 12 issues of Hush, right? And the best-selling issue of Hush by far was the one where Jason Todd was introduced as Red Hood. By far. And I'm no fool. This wasn't after MASH, or I'm using old references for a second.
No, I know MASH.
But this was my rota for my Mary Tyler Moore. So what happens is the Jason Todd book pops, and we're sitting there going, what are we going to do about this? And Judd Winnick, man, he jumped all over that shit like nobody's business. He goes, I can make this work. I'm like, let's do it. So that's how he came about. So Judd was writing Batman at the time, and that's how you get the Under the Hood story. But we brought him back because we saw some real potential there. And then, of course, my infamous Superman punch on the wall was the answer to all my problems and ills of the world. So I'm like, make it a Superman punch, and then we move on.
Superboy Prime punches reality and he wakes up.
Exactly. That was we need to explain all the continuity goofs with a simple punch on the wall.
Fair enough. And then And then what do you call it? He also wrote the movie too, to where
Yes, he did. Yeah,
That was
Judd's
super-
spectacular. I love
super
Judd. Judd was the first guy that I was able to give an exclusive contract to, and sign with me because he believed in what we were trying to do.
we're gonna have him on in about 2 weeks. Dan, you are the
It's
man,
so cool.
the myth, the legend, the real man, the real Double D. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
We have one more question. You have one more question? I'm sorry. Was there one more to go or?
About Batman, could you pick a particular moment or story arc that pushed Batman's ethical boundaries and how it impacted his journey?
Yeah, well, that's the one that we did with the OMAC. That's why we did the OMAC project.
Okay.
You know, because basically he had lost his faith and trust in all the other heroes.
Right.
I thought it was interesting what they had done in the Justice League series, but could have went further with it. You know, because I thought there was more story to tell from that. So by doing the Batman, creating the Brother Eye, which basically leads into the OMACs and all the other things happening, I think that was it. But I mean, that was the goal, was to create him in a spot where he was so ethically challenged that it fractured his relationships with Superman and Wonder Woman, which ultimately creates the opportunity which makes the Infinite Crisis happen.
Cool, man.
Wow.
All right, and I don't want to forget, what do you have going on coming out? What's going to be selling on your end?
Oh yeah, no, I'm still working with Frank. We got I got my Ancient Enemies books. I have a one shot called First Responder, which is one of the characters of the series. I have a one shot, his origin story, and a one shot comes out the end of August. And then I have Ancient Enemies 6 wraps up in the end of September. Got a couple of things on the fire that I'm looking at, but I have my first novel come out, still hoping to do a second one based on that, but we'll see how that works, which is a book called Hide or Seek. I had a lot of ideas over the years that I wrote little notes to, and ultimately they become original ideas now that I'm out of DC. So Hide or Seek was something that I had thought about, the ideas of superheroes in a witness protection program. So I built this story.
No, that's one that you had published, or was it?
Yeah, that's my book that I have published right now.
Is that on Audible?
No, it's just I'm sorry, I'm just still on paper these days.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Which don't you have one of the Ancient Enemies?
I
Brian?
do.
Yeah,
I
which one
have
is
an
it
Ancient
you have?
Enemy that Scott got me, and it's Certificate of Authenticity signed by
Well, there you
Dan.
go.
And I'm
There
like,
you go. You obviously got it from Midtown.
Yeah, actually, true.
well,
Yeah.
again,
But that actually, Ancient Enemies too is just these two warring races that brought it down to two individual combatants. They get killed in the process of arriving on Earth, and then their war transfers itself onto these two competing cities. And then these villains, these creatures rise up again, and basically it's the haves and have-nots battling it out. And the two cities of Citadel and Americana have nothing to do with Gotham City and Metropolis. Purely coincidental.
sure. Well,
Thank you so
again.
much for being with us.
You're
Meeting
welcome.
you.
Thanks a lot, guys. A pleasure talking to you all.
And it's like, no, Dan Didio's like on the screen. I'm talking to him. He's answering my questions. It was funny. I'm like, where's Double D? And he goes, I'm here. And it's like, where are you?